The next transition I'll be covering is the turnaround transition. And this is similar to the drum fill transition, only that this is working with melodic sounds instead of drums and percussive sounds. So when you're making music, you're going to have what's called a musical phrase. And those phrases can tend to be either 4 bars or 8 bars or even 16 bars in length. And you can use a turnaround at the end of a phrase, sort of like how a drum fill comes at the end of a drum phrase. So, for example, at the end of the phrase with these drums, there's a little tag or fill at the end of this. So you can hear the double clap and that little drum roll kind of thing filling in at the end of this phrase. Now with the turnaround, you're going to have a melodic phrase. And for this particular track, I'm using just a bass synth that's creating the melodic phrase. So you can hear at the end of that repeating pattern right here, it does a little something extra, and that is the turnaround. The turnaround is a phrase that I picked up from another friend of mine who plays guitar, and he would just refer to that as a way of kind of transitioning back to the beginning of the phrase. So this turnaround can happen after 4 bars like it does here. So you see that's 4 bars, and at the end of the 4 bars, we have the turnaround at the end of the phrase to bring it back to the original pattern. You can also have an 8-bar phrase. So in this particular track, I have a bass synth where the turnaround doesn't happen until the end of the 8th bar. And it sounds like this. So you can hear right at the very end of that phrase, we add in a couple extra notes to make it feel like it's coming back or something new is coming up, and it just brings you right back to the top of the phrase again. Adding turnarounds to your music is a lot easier to do when you know the key of the song you're in, because you're simply just taking some different notes from the key or the scale of that song and then playing them at the end of the phrase. So if you're able to create a pattern of notes using 3 or 4 notes within the scale, then you can use maybe 2 or 3 other notes in the scale that you're not playing to make it feel like it's doing something different. So for example, you can see that I'm using this G sharp, I'm using this B, and I'm using this E, and also this D sharp or E flat. And then towards the end of the phrase, I'm using a couple extra notes. So I'm using this C sharp, and again with this higher D sharp, and back to this B, which leads right back to the beginning of this G sharp. So this phrase is hovering in this kind of area between these 4 notes this entire time. And then at the end of the phrase, I take it out of those 4 notes and play some higher notes to make it feel like something different is happening. You don't always need a whole lot of notes at the end of the phrase. You can see I've got only 4 notes at the end of this phrase for the turnaround. Sometimes you can do it with it as little as 1 or 2 notes. Now, you don't always have to use the same instrument for the turnaround. So for example, in this track that I created, I have the bass line, but the bass line doesn't necessarily have the turnaround inside of it. And that's pretty much the bass line throughout the song. Now what I did was I used this Scarby Mark I and actually used that as a turnaround at the end of the phrase. And so what I was doing with this was I was pretty much just playing some notes at the end of the phrase using this instrument instead of the bass instrument. And that sounds like this. And so turnarounds like that are pretty easy to do when you know the scale of the song and the key that you're playing in for that track. And I'll show you what I mean. So this track is in a G major scale. And so now all I have to do is play the notes in that scale in different ways, and I can add these little turnarounds at the end of the phrases. So at the end of this next phrase, I added something a little bit faster than the first one. And in the track, it sounds like this. So you can hear it's a good way to kind of break things up and change things before bringing it back to the beginning of the phrase again. And so that's just some ways you can make use of turnarounds in your tracks.